Imagine this. You pour years of your life, right?
Mhm.
Countless late nights, surviving on instant noodles, all to build this grand company from scratch. You're dreaming of the day it goes public.
The big payoff.
Exactly. And a huge part of your personal stake, your reward for all that sacrifice, it's tied up in something called employee stock options, or ESOPs.
Crucial for early-stage founders.
But then, just as you're, about to pop the champagne, you're told you have to give up a big piece of that dream before anyone else even gets a taste.
Ouch. Yeah, it's got to sting.
Well, brace yourself, because we're talking about a really significant turning point today. We've been digging deep into a pivotal decision that's seriously reshaping the landscape for startups here in India.
It really is.
It's a genuine shift, and believe me, it has founders, investors, market watchers, everyone buzzing, like really buzzing.
And we're here to unpack exactly what happened on June 18th, 2025.
Okay.
There was this landmark announcement, and it fundamentally altered the rules for startup founders, specifically those classified as promoters. We want to show you why this isn't just some, dry regulatory update. It's actually a critical lifeline for India's incredibly dynamic startup ecosystem.
Okay, let's dive in then. Maybe start with the basics. What exactly are ESOPs? Just so everyone's on the same page.
Good idea. So think of ESOPs like golden tickets, maybe. Special invitations for employees, and this is key, including the founders themselves. They give you the right to buy company shares later on, but at a price that's set now, usually much lower than the future market price.
Right. It's how cash-strapped startups can compete for talent.
Exactly. It's their way of saying, look, we can't pay you a massive salary right now, but stick with us, be part of this journey, and you'll own a valuable piece of this thing when it really takes off.
And for founders, that's often their main compensation for years, right? All the sweat, the tears, missing family dinners.
Absolutely. It often represents years of pure hard work, immense personal sacrifice. It's not just a bonus, it's their skin in the game.
Okay, so that's the golden ticket part. But you mentioned a catch. The system got sticky. Where did it go wrong for founders specifically?
Right. Here's where it got really complicated. A major hurdle. Under the old rules, if you were a founder classified as a promoter.
And promoter basically means someone with significant control or influence.
Precisely. If you were tagged as a promoter, you were essentially forced to give up those ESOPs before the company's initial public offering, the IPO.
Before. Wow.
Yes. If you still held any ESOPs, when your company filed its draft red herring prospectus, that's the big pre-IPO document, you had to liquidate them, get rid of them.
Liquidate how? Just forfeit them.
Often it meant selling them off. And frequently that was at a disadvantage, right? Compared to what they might be worth after a successful IPO.
That seems counterintuitive. Why would you penalize the very people who built the company?
That was the critical question everyone was asking. It seemed fundamentally unfair to penalize the individuals who poured their vision, their effort, everything into building the company from day one.
Was there a big case, like a well-known example that really highlighted this issue, something that maybe shook the industry?
Oh, definitely. The most striking one, the one that really got everyone talking, was Paytm's parent company, 197 Communications, back in 2021.
Right, I remember that IPO.
Well, its managing director and CEO, Vijay Shekhar Sharma, because he was classified as a promoter, he was actually compelled to surrender a huge number of shares. We're talking 2.1 crore shares.
2.1 crore. How much was that worth?
At the time, it was valued at an astounding 1,800 crore.
Wow. That's mind-boggling. 1,800 crore.
The monumental amount.
Oh.
Enough to buy a small island, probably.
So what happened then? What was the reaction in the startup world to his situation? Did it genuinely make founders nervous about going public?
It absolutely sent shockwaves. Real, palpable fear. Founders across the country started asking themselves, is this going to happen to me? Will I end up like Vijay, watching my ESOPs vanish just as the company finally makes it?
You can see why.
Yeah. This uncertainty, this fear of losing their hard-earned stake right at the finish line, it genuinely put a damper on the enthusiasm for IPOs, especially for those high-growth tech startups where ESOPs are so central.
So it wasn't just a theoretical problem, it was actively discouraging companies.
Definitely. It became a crucial wake-up call for the regulator.
Yeah.
They realized something needed to change.
Okay, so sensing this fear, seeing cases like Sharma's, what did the regulator do? What was the response?
Well, this widespread concern, it directly led to action. It wasn't immediate, but after months of pretty extensive consultations.
Which involved getting feedback from the industry, presumably.
Yes, including releasing a detailed discussion paper back in March 2025 to gather views. Then finally, the landmark decision was announced, June 18th, 2025. That was the day things decisively shifted.
And the core change, what does the new rule actually say?
Okay, here's the key update, the absolute heart of it. Startup founders who are classified as promoters can now hold on to their ESOPs. They can exercise them even after their company goes public.
Yeah.
Okay, that's huge. No forced selling before the IPO.
Exactly. But there's a very important condition, a catch, if you will.
Ah, always a catch. What is it?
Those ESOPs must have been granted at least 1 year before the company files its draft red herring prospectus, the DRHP.
1 year before filing. Okay, so you can't just grant yourself a ton of options right before you decide to go public.
Precisely. That's the idea behind it.
That 1 year gap, the cooling off period, as you called it, it sounds quite deliberate. What's the thinking there? What balance are they trying to achieve?
Yeah, it's quite clever, really. It strikes a balance. That cooling off period, the 1 year gap, it's specifically designed to prevent any sort of opportunistic behavior.
Like gaming the system just before the IPO.
Exactly. Like founders giving themselves massive ESOP grants right before filing the DRHP just to cash in on the public market excitement. It prevents that last-minute rush.
Makes sense.
And it's also a pragmatic recognition of how startups actually work. Founders often take ESOPs instead of big salaries in those early lean years. This acknowledges that reality.
So it's not just about preventing misuse, but also about fairness to the founders' early sacrifices.
Right. And if you look at the bigger picture, this whole move sends a really powerful signal. The head of the regulator actually said something like, "This decision will convince startup founders to come to the public markets."
So it's an active encouragement, rolling out the red carpet almost.
You could say that. Clearing a major hurdle, making Indian markets more attractive for homegrown companies to list right here.
We know India's startup scene is, well, exploding. Over 100,000 startups, 125 unicorns as of this year. It's incredible. But going public is still a massive step. How much did those old ESOP rules really hold things back, especially for tech companies?
They created a lot of uncertainty. You have to remember, founders' actual shareholdings often get heavily diluted after multiple funding rounds, sometimes down to single-digit percentages.
Right. VCs come in, early investors.
Exactly. So ESOPs become their primary way of staying meaningfully invested, keeping that long-term alignment. The fear of losing those ESOPs just before the IPO, it was like a sword hanging over their heads.
Can you give another example of that uncertainty?
Sure. There's the case of Health Vista India. They're the parent company of Paytm Medical. In their first DRHP filing in 2022, they initially stated they had no promoters.
Interesting.
But then later, in March 2023, they were actually required by the regulator to reclassify their founders as promoters.
Ah, so that kind of back and forth creates confusion.
Immense confusion and uncertainty, that regulatory ambiguity around who's a promoter and what happens to their ESOPs really stifled confidence.
Yeah.
Now, hopefully that fog is clearing. Founders get much needed assurance. They can plan for an IPO without that specific fear.
And you mentioned this helps with reverse flipping, too, getting Indian startups headquartered abroad to come back and list in India.
Yes, it's definitely a factor there. It strengthens the case for coming back home. Well, if you're an Indian founder who set up shop in, say, Singapore or the US, maybe for tax reasons or easier funding initially, you might be considering where to list eventually. If India's rules, like these ESOP rules, become more founder-friendly and globally competitive.
It makes listing here more appealing.
Exactly. It's like the regulator is putting out a welcome mat, saying, come back, the environment here is supportive. It helps deepen our own capital markets by attracting those companies back.
How does this new Indian rule stack up globally? Are other countries doing similar things, or are we sort of leading the way here?
It's interesting. India isn't alone in grappling with founder ESOPs. Different countries have different approaches.
Like where?
Well, the U.S. has certain restrictions, particularly around stock options for highly compensated employees. Singapore requires shareholder approval for large grants, especially to individuals with significant voting power. Germany has its own set of exclusions, like for supervisory board members.
So there are controls elsewhere, too.
Definitely. But India's new rule, particularly recognizing the dilution founders face, brings us much closer to, let's say, accommodating the specific journey of a startup founder compared to a traditional company promoter. It acknowledges their unique path.
So it makes India more competitive on that front.
Undeniably.
Yeah.
It makes our capital markets more attractive on the global stage for these kinds of high-growth companies.
You also mentioned earlier that this ESOP decision on June 18th wasn't an isolated event. It was part of a bigger package of reforms.
That's right. It was one piece of a larger effort to streamline things and make India's markets more dynamic.
What else was in that package, briefly?
There were several things. A big one was a new mandate for dematerialization, basically making sure more shareholdings are held electronically, which increases transparency, especially before an IPO. Everyone has to show their cards, so to speak.
Okay. More transparency. What else?
There was also new flexibility introduced for public sector undertakings, state-owned enterprises, making it easier for them to delist if needed. They eased some norms for foreign portfolio investors, FPIs.
Making it easier for foreign money to come in.
Potentially, yes.
Yeah.
And also more maneuverability for alternative investment funds, AIFs, allowing them to co-invest alongside other investors in unlisted companies. Even real estate and infrastructure investment trusts, the REITs and invitees, got more flexibility in how they distribute cash flow.
So quite a broad range of changes.
Yes, it paints this picture of a regulator really trying to fine-tune the whole market ecosystem, balancing that ease of doing business with, crucially, investor protection. It's a complex juggling act.
Okay, so the new ESOP rule, it fixes a big problem, but as with any major change, there must be some criticisms or potential downsides people are talking about.
Oh, absolutely. No change is ever perfect, right? There are valid questions being raised.
Like what? What are the main concerns?
One point is whether this blurs the lines too much between founders and regular employees.
Right.
Well, the argument goes, should promoters who have significant control and influence over the company's direction really get the same type of incentive like ESOPs as employees who don't have that power? Is it equitable? It's a debate about governance, essentially.
I see the point. Should the captain get the same bonus structure as the crew?
Sort of, yeah. It's a valid question about differential roles and rewards.
And what about the one-year cooling off period? Is everyone happy with that specific time frame?
Not entirely. That's another point of discussion. Some critics have called that one-year mark a bit arbitrary.
Arbitrary how?
Well, they argue it lacks some clarity. What happens if a company have a sudden opportunity, maybe market conditions become perfect, and they want to go public sooner than they originally planned, maybe within that one-year window?
Could the rule force them to delay?
Potentially. Could it inadvertently hold up an IPO or create disputes? Startups move incredibly fast, Their timelines aren't always neat and predictable like that.
That's true. The market window can open and close quickly.
Exactly. And there's also the ever-present risk of misuse. Can clever founders find ways to game the system? Maybe by front-loading ESOP grants just before that one-year look-back period starts? Vigilance will be key.
Okay, let's shift perspective. If I'm an investor looking at potential startup IPOs, what does this mean for me? For my wallet?
Good question. For investors, there are definitely upsides.
Such as?
Well, the big one is potentially more choice. This move could genuinely encourage more high-growth, exciting startups, maybe the next big tech name, to actually come to the public market here in India.
So more opportunities to invest early in potential success stories.
Right. More listings mean more options for you as an investor.
Yeah.
And more competition among companies listing could, in theory, lead to better valuations and push companies towards greater transparency, which is always good for investors.
Okay, that sounds positive, but is there a flip side? Any potential risks for public shareholders?
There's always a nuanced view, yes. One potential consideration is alignment of interest. If founders retain significant ESOPs after the IPO, their focus might remain very long-term. They might prioritize reinvesting heavily in growth, maybe delaying profitability.
Which could be good for the company long-term.
Absolutely. But it might frustrate public market investors who are perhaps looking for quicker returns, dividends, or faster profit growth. Their timelines might not perfectly match.
So, a potential tension between founder vision and shareholder expectations.
It's possible. The regulator is essentially betting that the one-year cooling-off period, plus existing disclosure rules about executive compensation, will be enough to keep things fair and transparent. But investors will definitely need to do their homework. Read those prospectuses carefully.
Understood. So the takeaway for startups thinking about an IPO seems clear.
Plan ahead. Plan your ESOP grants strategically. Make sure they happen well over a year before you even think about filing that DRHP. Be mindful of that clock.
And for investors, our listeners,
get ready to dig into those startup prospectuses. They're likely to become even more common And understanding the ESOP situation for founders will be a key part of your analysis. It's about to get a lot more interesting.
Absolutely.
What's really striking here is how much of a boost this decision is for the whole startup ecosystem in India, allowing founders to keep their ESOPs post-IPO. It's like giving a marathon runner a much-needed drink station halfway through.
Yeah, it doesn't get them across the finish line on its own.
Exactly, but it sure helps them keep going, maintain that momentum. It removes a major source of friction and anxiety.
So, by tackling this long-standing issue, this pain point, the regulator is actively trying to bring more of these innovative companies into the public markets, which ultimately benefits India's capital markets and hopefully gives people like you, our listeners, more opportunities.
Precisely. Though, of course, safeguards are needed, and you can bet critics and market watchers will be keeping a very close eye on how this plays out, looking for any unintended consequences or loopholes.
Which leads to a really interesting final thought for you to consider. That 1 year cooling off period, is it the perfect balance? Or will the sheer speed of the startup world, the pace of innovation, eventually demand even more flexibility from regulators down the line?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it?
And what does this fundamental shift mean for the next generation of founders? Those dreaming right now of building the next big thing and maybe, just maybe, ringing that bell at the BSE or NSE one day. It's a powerful reminder, isn't it? Even the biggest regulators can, and sometimes must, adapt when the market demands it. But that journey of innovation, it's definitely never truly finished.